morning, everybody. It's a joy to be with you today. Hey, Jonathan, is there? Oh, there it is. It's coming back. This is great. You're on it. Thank you. So, great introductions. I mean, we have such a great diversity of people here who've been working for the church for months all the way to a number of years. So as Jonathan said, I'm from Franciscan University of Steubenville. I teach on the theology faculty, but my specialization over this time has been catechetics primarily. Because I began working for the church as a youth minister right when I graduated from high school in 1989 with zero formation, no degree, no background. Is there anybody else that's in the same boat? Yeah? Okay, a couple of you. Jonathan, too. I was blessed. I'm from the Diocese of Phoenix originally. I was blessed to work in a parish where there was very much a pastor who wanted to mentor me. The staff was really extraordinary. It was a place where I came to faith as a teenager at this parish. I made a lot of mistakes, as you would expect an 18, 19, 20, and 21-year-old to make. Was there anybody here at World Youth Day in Denver, 1993? I'm the only one? Okay. So it was an extraordinary experience with Pope St. John Paul II. It was really hot, and a lot of people were getting dehydrated, and so at the Papal Mass at Cherry Creek State Park, I spent the entire Mass carrying people to IV tents because there wasn't enough water and all of this. So after the liturgy was over, there was a mass of, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people just walking, moving towards buses, and we're trying to keep track of everybody. And we got people on the bus, and we decided we were going to stay at a hotel that night instead of just jumping right back into the ride so that everybody could just rest a little bit. So I remember going into my hotel room and just collapsing on the bed when about 2 minutes later there's a frantic knock on the door. I'm detailing one of my mistakes, by the way. Frantic knock on the door, and I open the door, and it's one of my adult team leaders, and she said, "You have to turn channel 3 on right now." So I turned on channel 3, and one of our teenagers was being interviewed from back at Cherry Creek State Park. She was talking about how much she loved Pope John Paul II, but then she also said, "I don't know where my youth minister is. I can't find him." So, 50-year-old me looks back with horror at 22-year-old me and some of the lovely mistakes that I made. So I'm now at Franciscan University of Steubenville. I've been there this is my 20th year. My two greatest joys in my work is I get to form undergraduates their senior year, specifically in catechetical methodology. Those are my passion courses, because I get to help them to learn how to teach for conversion. And then my second great joy is we have a thriving online Master's in Catechetics and Evangelization program. And I thought I would hate working online at first, but I've really grown to love it, and being able to work with people all over the world has been such a great experience. Let's see if I can figure this out. I'm sure it works. Yeah, okay, so there's 2 books that I've written. The first is focused on sacramental preparation and how that very important work that we share can be, should be, must be today aligned with the call to discipleship. How do we evangelize those who we're forming for any sacramental preparation? And then the second one is a book that follows very much on today's presentations, and I'll explain more about that later. I've been married for 17 years. We have 3 teenage daughters, and I was a youth minister, back in 1989, and now I'm realizing I don't know much about teenagers anymore. With my own, we're in entirely new waters now in our house. So A few years back, there was a book written by Sherry Waddell called Forming Intentional Disciples. How many of you encountered this book in one way or another? Yeah, the majority. I would argue this is the most important book focused towards parish ministry, parish evangelization that has ever been written because of the conversation that it's generated. And you'll remember, since you have some experience with this book, her primary thesis statement, which is the majority of Catholics in the United States are sacramentalized, but not evangelized, she says. That's a provocative claim, isn't it? Her concern is that while the majority of Catholics who go to Mass have received the sacraments, most of them have not made a personal decision to commit themselves to Jesus as a disciple. Even after 6 years, 8 years, 12 years of Catholic schooling or parish catechesis. And because of that reality, she's very concerned, of course, with the viability of our Catholic institutions, our Catholic schools, our Catholic parishes, etc., if our people remain sacramentalized but not evangelized. Is that a realistic concern for us to have? Yeah, I think so. I think it's the dominant concern that we ought to have today. So here's a thumbprint of how she describes the problem. 2 generations ago, so I'm thinking here of my grandparents. 2 generations ago, if Catholic adults had not consciously decided to center their lives on Jesus and follow him, if they weren't, as Sherry Waddell says, intentional disciples, by and large, did they continue to go to Mass 2 generations ago?
Yes.
Yes, very much so. Did they continue to get married in the church? Did they continue to send their kids to Catholic schools or parish schools of religion? Yeah, absolutely. Is this the same situation that we have today? We're in very, very different waters. The U.S. bishops in 2005 wrote the National Directory for Catechesis. And I think they're putting their finger on an essential characteristic of the people that we are ministering today. They wrote in the National Directory, young people are taught both by the excitement generated by technology and the effervescence of pop culture to reject something if it bores them, they said. Now, thinking back 2 generations ago, thinking of my grandparents. My grandfather was a Byzantine cantor up in the Cleveland diocese. Thinking of him, is it possible that, once a year when he was at Mass, he might have been slightly bored or thinking about something else during the liturgy? I would imagine so. Did he leave? Did he reject the church because of that indifference or that boredom? No. And sociologically, if we were to look at statistics, that's not what was happening several generations ago, but today, we're in a very different situation. That which is boring, that which doesn't immediately make sense, is rejected today. For me, the most telling statistic in her book was this one, and I think it impacts specifically what we're talking about today. Only 48% of Catholics are absolutely certain that the God that they believe in is a God with whom it is possible to have a personal relationship. Notice she's not saying that only 48% of Catholics would say that they have a personal relationship with God. She's saying only 48% of Catholics think that it's even possible to have a personal relationship. To put a face on this, I want to just share something personal. What I think is an extraordinary conversation that I had with my dad a couple months ago. We were on our way out of the house and the phone rang and I picked it up and it was my dad and he said, "James, I need to talk to you." And so I sat down And I said, what's going on, Dad? And my dad is a subscriber, my mom and dad, to the Catechetic Review. And it's because they love me. They love me, and so they want to have the magazine. And my dad said, I was reading something in here, and I do not understand what this means, and I need you to explain it to me. And I said, okay, what is it? He said, I've been a Catholic all my life. I go to Mass on every Sunday, and I go to confession regularly, but I don't understand what this means when I read that we should have a personal relationship with God. I don't understand what does that mean, that we can know God personally. I go to Mass, and I've done the Catholic thing, and I try to pray regularly, but I don't understand what that means. What does that mean? So it was possible for him through most of his life to not really get this, to think that being a Catholic is primarily about sacramental participation, following the teachings of the church. But he didn't get it, he didn't quite understand what this means, that we can encounter Jesus in a personal way, that we can know him personally. So while it was possible for him to go most of his life without understanding, I would argue with Sherry Waddell that it is less and less possible today that people are going to remain Catholic and attached to the church, identify as Catholics, if they aren't doing so out of conviction today. Because those cultural supports that were present several generations ago are not present today, or they're ebbing away. Let me give just a little bit more about this Catholic culture that my dad would have known. He just turned 80 this last year. Let me give you an intriguing example here. A couple years ago, my wife's grandmother passed away. And as her family was going through the very difficult task of going through her belongings, they found something really, really fascinating, and they gave it to me. What they found is this little book. It's not a professionally published book. It was written by her pastor in 1953, and the book is called Catholic Etiquette, that he gave out to all of his parishioners back in 1953. I want to read to you from page 1 of the Catholic Etiquette book, because we'd expect whatever comes first to be really, really important, right, in the Catholic Etiquette. Before I read it, does anybody want to take a guess at what might appear first in this book?
Beyond time.
Beyond time? Any other thoughts?
How to dress.
How to dress? Wrong. Anybody else want to take a stab?
God is judging you, something like that.
No? So no. All right, here it is. And it's titled A Fundamental Principle for Every Catholic. Okay? Every Catholic, regardless of any circumstances whatsoever, should make himself and all of his household known to the pastor of the parish in which he resides. If you're moving out of one parish into another, it is courteous and proper for you to inform your parish priest that you are leaving. It is even more proper, and the mark of a good Catholic, to make yourself known to the pastor or the priest of the parish into which you have moved. This should be done immediately, not months or years later. And that's principle number 1 in the book that was given out in this rural Illinois diocese. What do you notice here? If you were writing a book, a little booklet that you were going to give out to all of your parishioners, what would you want to be number 1? I ask that sort of rhetorically because what we're not seeing as number 1 is an emphasis on fundamental principles of the Catholic life. Right? We're not seeing a focus right at the beginning on the essentials of what it is to be Catholic. And if you were to read through the book, and you're welcome to, just give it back. I want to keep this. You're welcome to take a look through it. What you'll notice is much of the book is focused on behavior, and the interior spirit of what's needed isn't very present. It's presumed, right? It's not present. Could you imagine giving such a book to your parishioners today? Probably not. Probably not. Because there's been a massive cultural shift within Catholic America. So, for the last 20 to 30 years or so, there's been this shift away from what Sherry Waddell would call cultural Catholicism. And in her book, she's very critical of what she calls cultural Catholicism. I think there were some real strengths in a Catholic culture being present in parishes and schools and communities. But as those supports have been ebbing away, they cannot be realistically relied upon to sustain us in the years going forward. And I think we would all agree that that's the new scenario that we face today. So if a young adult Catholic is going to retain her Catholic identity as she moves into relationships and university or the workplace, into family life, if she's going to retain her Catholic identity today, perhaps more so than 50 years ago, it's going to come from a place of conviction, right? Because the cultural supports aren't as evident. So our question today is this. What does this new paradigm that we're all facing, what does this mean for how we carry out catechesis, for how we teach the faith? Because what worked 50 years ago, 30 years ago in catechesis isn't going to work today, because that which is boring is rejected, the bishops say in the National Directory. I believe that one very important way forward for us when it comes to this issue and this question can be found in the new directory for catechesis, which was just published last year. And in the new directory, in the introduction, it describes one primary reason why the church needed a new directory. Any guesses as to what that reason is? It's sort of easy to miss. It's right in the, I think it's in the preface actually. Why do we need a new directory today?
Because we're in new times.
We're very much.
New personalities, new habits.
Yeah. They focus a lot in the directory on the fact that we live in a digital age and how that's going to impact catechesis. But at the very beginning, in the first 2 pages of the text, the primary reason why we needed a new directory is because the church believes we need to recover what Pope Francis calls Kerygmatic Catechesis. How many of you are familiar with that term? Kerygmatic Catechesis. Okay, so it's a catechesis that puts at its center not just the explanation of Christian doctrine, but at its center the proclamation of the good news of Jesus and the call to conversion, the Kerygma. The document quotes, when it's describing this primary reason, it quotes Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium. And let's see. We lost this. All right, thank you. Quotes Pope Francis. Sorry, that's a little bit hard to read. This is Evangelii Gaudium 164 to 165. I think these are some of the most profound words about catechesis that have appeared in the magisterial document. He writes, "We have rediscovered the fundamental role of the first announcement, or the Kerygma, which needs to be the center of all evangelizing activity and all the efforts at church renewal. This first proclamation is called first, not because it exists at the beginning and can then can be forgotten or replaced by other more important things. It's first in a qualitative sense because it is the principal proclamation, the one that we have to hear over and over again in different ways, the one which we catechists must announce one way or another throughout the process of catechesis at every level and moment. Now, many of us are familiar with the kerygma, the proclamation of the gospel, as being something that happens, that should happen in evangelization. What Pope Francis is saying is it's necessary that this be taking place in catechesis. So, why do we need a new directory today? Why do we need new approaches, new creativity? Because those who are being catechized today have a significant need not just to have the faith explained, but to also have it proclaimed, have it proposed, not just explained. Now, a couple things. This ideal of a Kerygmatic catechesis did not originate with Pope Francis. It goes back further. Now, we can say, of course, that it originates with who? Jesus himself, right? And the apostles in the early church. But within the 20th century, Pope Francis here is talking about a recovery of this, and it needs to be recovered because it's been lost in pastoral practice. But Pope Francis wasn't the first to call attention to this. We can go back to the General Directory for Catechesis in 1997. Article number 98 says that the definitive aim of catechesis is to present Christ and everything else in relation to him. Okay, that's a very kerygmatic statement. Can we go back further? Yes. We can go to the publication of the Catechism at the very beginning, article number 25. And a lot of people are surprised to find out that this statement actually comes from the Catechism of the Council of Trent, upon which the Baltimore Catechism was based. The whole concern of doctrine and its teaching must be directed to the love that never ends. That is, the life and the love of the Blessed Trinity. Whether something is proposed for belief, for hope, or for action, in other words, no matter what it is that we're teaching, the love of our Lord must always be made accessible, the Catechism says. So no matter what it is that we're teaching, we have to be able to see how that teaching comes from love. So that anyone can see that all the works of perfect Christian virtue, in other words, so that anybody can see that the Church's moral teachings spring from love and have no other objective than to arrive at love. Can we go back further? My point is, it's not just Pope Francis, but this has been in the magisterial teaching. Let's go to 1979, the first year of Pope John Paul II's papacy. And these are probably the most frequently cited words about catechesis from a magisterial statement. You've probably heard this before. The definitive aim of catechesis, and it's so beautiful, the vivid language that he uses here, is to put people not only in touch, but in communion, in intimacy with Jesus Christ. So somehow, the teaching of the content of the faith is meant to be done in such a way that it brings us more deeply into this intimate relationship with Jesus. That's a very profound idea, isn't it? And I think it's a very challenging idea because for most of us in this room, it's unlikely that the catechesis that we received when we were kids did this very well. This connection between doctrine and intimate communion, discipleship with Jesus. And I would argue that today, if we're going to do this well, and I think there's no greater need in catechesis, today, if we're going to do this well, then we have to intentionally make connections in the way that we teach the faith. And that's largely what this is going to be about today. So in this morning presentation, I want to lay the foundations with what Kerygmatic Catechesis means. And then in the afternoon, we're going to get very, very practical and concrete. Okay. So it originated with Pope John Paul II then? No, it goes back further. So let's go back to the origin point of this. And we would have to go to Germany all the way back to 1936 to a theologian. He was a liturgical theologian. His name, I'm sorry, not Germany, Austria. This is Father Josef Jungmann. He was a Jesuit. He taught at the University of Innsbruck. And this idea of a recovery of Kerygmatic Catechesis, which is how Jesus taught, which is how this is what we see in the early church. Father Jungmann wanted to recover this. This first appeared in a book in 1936 that shook the catechetical foundations of the church at this time in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. The book was called The Good News and Our Proclamation of the Faith. I want you to notice how kerygmatic that title is. It's not called, this book wasn't called The Content of the Faith and Our Explanation of It. It was called The Good News and Our Proclamation of the Faith. Now, as you're going to see, I don't want you to be getting nervous. Like, does this guy not think that we need to be teaching content? No, I believe it with all of my heart. But it's about how we teach that content and what that content is connected to that we need to focus on. So what did Jungmann have to say? And I'm well aware that history lessons can sometimes put us to sleep, but I almost guarantee, through no merits of my own, but just how fascinating this is that we're going to be looking at, that you're going to be totally with me this morning. So what did he have to say? Well, he was deeply concerned about the quality of the catechesis of his time in 1936. Well, does that sort of strike you as odd a little bit? Is that kind of humorous? Because we can look back, I think, to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s and say, what's wrong with catechesis back then? This is at least in this country, the golden age of Catholic life. That Catholic schools couldn't be built quickly enough. Our parishes were packed. People knew the faith. I have an uncle up in Cleveland who was educated in the late 1940s into the 1950s. And when I first became a theology professor, Franciscan, our family would go up and visit him, and he would say, oh yeah, good, a theologian guy, come in here, I have some questions for you. And he remembered the content, much of the content of the Balfour Catechism. He still had, firmly entrenched in his mind. And so he would start asking me these theological questions because he knew, he remembered what he was taught during those years. It's just fascinating because this is not the situation that we have today. So there was a lot that was strong and on the exterior looked very vibrant about Catholic life. But Jungmann was worried. What was he worried about? Really, this was the time of, in the 1940s, we had movies like The Song of Bernadette and The Bells of St. Mary's were both nominated for Best Picture with the Academy Awards. There was the Catholic Church and Catholicism was respected and supported culturally in many, many ways. So what was he worried about? Well, here's how he described the problem in 1936. So he wrote, most people, and he's talking about Catholics, most people know all the sacraments, They know about the person of Christ as well as about Our Lady, Peter and Paul, Adam and Eve, and a good many others. They know enough about the commandments of God and of the church. Let's pause there for a second. What a different time than today, right? So is this the same situation today? That we know all of this as Catholics? No, not at all. But here's the problem. But what is lacking among the faithful is a sense of unity. Seeing it all, that is, all of these different doctrinal teachings, seeing it all as a whole, as a unity, an understanding of the wonderful message of divine grace. Okay, so his problem is that Catholics knew a lot of doctrine, but they didn't understand what this doctrine had to do with the kerygma, with the invitation to discipleship, with the call to communion with God. They weren't able to really articulate that. I have this memory of my dad when I was a little boy. Somebody came knocking on our front door, and he opened it up, and it was a Jehovah's Witness. And my dad immediately said, "Oh, I'm not interested, I'm a Catholic." And the missionary knocking on the door said, "Oh, you're a Catholic. Well, tell me what you believe. What do you believe as a Catholic?" And my dad, I remember the expression on his face. He just took a step back. He knew a lot of doctrine and a lot of teaching, but he didn't know how to put it in a sentence or two. Right? He didn't know what's the golden thread that unites all of this doctrinal content into one single, very profound message of grace, of good news. And that's the problem that Jungmann saw. All that they retain of Christian doctrine is a string of dogmas and moral precepts, threats and promises, customs and rites, tasks and duties. So what he was critical of in 1936 was this fragmented approach. That we teach a lot of doctrine, we explain a lot of doctrine, but there's very little proclamation taking place. And most Catholics are not coming out of our Catholic schools and our parishes with the understanding of the Christian message that would have been very, very familiar to those in apostolic times. Right? And many Catholics are, as a result of this, they're comfortable talking about the church, very comfortable talking about doctrinal things, but not so comfortable talking about Jesus and having a relationship with God and being a disciple of the Lord. So this is what he was really concerned about, is this abyss that had sort of opened up, right? That with a lot of understanding, a lot of knowledge, but not much relationship taking place. Now, people at his time, many of them dismissed his concerns. We don't need to be worried about this. Our Catholic schools are full, our parishes are thriving. What are you so hung up about? Joseph, they might say. Well, I think his concern is prophetic. Because what happens then? A decade later, 3 decades later, 5 decades later, what happens 100 years later with this foundation that's being built, where the kerygma isn't central to our understanding of the faith? In another place, and I think this is a good summary of what he was trying to do. So he wrote that book in 1936, and it spurred a worldwide conversation about not doctrine, but how the content of the faith was being formulated, how it was being given. So he went on to say, to restore the kerygma to its full power and clarity, into one single message, proclaiming with joy and love the beauty and the promise of the kingdom of God, this is the task of the Kerygmatic renewal. Its chief aim is to present the truths of faith, all of the doctrinal teachings, as an organic whole. The core, at the center of this organic unity, core, at the center of our catechesis should be the good news of our redemption in Christ. And its fruit should be our grateful and loving response to God's loving call. Let's pause for just a second. I think this is very reminiscent of what Pope Francis is saying, and what the GDC said, and what the Catechism said, and what Pope St. John Paul II said. Any comments on this? Can you put this into your own words? What does this mean to you? That is, presenting the truths of the faith as an organic whole. And what's the primary quality of this organic unity of the faith that we're passing on? It's rooted in, saturated with, the proclamation of the good news of our redemption. And because of that, the fruit of our catechesis should be a grateful and loving response to God. What do you think?
When you were talking about the book Etiquette, and you asked the rhetorical question, I said, what should it begin with? God is love, and you're called to live in that love. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so powerful that all those years ago, my dad was born in 1936. And it's so powerful to me that a priest is saying its fruit should be our grateful and loving response to God's loving call.
Yeah.
Because that's language that is so needed, but it's amazing to me that was almost 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And that there's still people because we see the saints throughout the 20th century. So people got it.
Yes.
But the message wasn't getting to, Joe Catholic. So I don't know, I just think that's really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, and just following on something you're saying. I want you to see the logic of this. That with the proposal, with the proclamation, with a real understanding of the good news of the gospel for me, that ought to provoke a response from me. And so many catechists that I talk to these days are they're struggling under the burden of non-responsive students, right? Who just seem indifferent and don't really care about what's being presented. Well, I think there's great wisdom here because with a Kerygmatic catechesis, if done correctly, it provokes a responsiveness. We're going to talk about that this afternoon. What else?
What comes to mind for me is 1 Peter 3:15. To always be prepared to give defense to anyone who calls you to account for the goodness that's inside of you. And I think that is so central to this idea, and everything that I challenge students with, or the people that I work with, to if somebody comes up to you on the street, politicians have their stump speeches, right? Like 30 seconds, you're going to give your entire platform. It's like, as Catholics, do we have that? And I think I challenge people with that idea. If somebody comes up to you and asks you this question, what would you say? And really, I think just practicing it is so essential to being successful at it.
And you're involved in campus ministry?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously so essential to your work.
Yes.
But not just the campus ministers, it's essential to all of our work. If you were to ask your catechists, to ask the kids and the teenagers that they're forming, what does it mean to be Catholic? What's at the very center of the Catholic life? How are they going to, do they have the words to respond to that? And whatever it is that's at the center, and he's describing it here as it's the good news of our redemption. This is the truth upon which we can base our entire Christian life as individuals and as a church. It's what Jesus has done for us, what God has done for us.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this organic form. For me, I visualize it a lot as like a whole song or like a harmony of like the guiding melody would be the gospel of Christ, and you want to say like talking about the Virgin Mary or all the other doctrines are those harmonies that really bring out the beauty of the song. So that then the students would then kind of want to respond and sing along with us. So that's how I visualize it.
It's beautiful imagery there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But then my question is, how do I invite other people to visualize it that way? Like, do you foresee it would be good to actually start the class and say, like, hey, think of it as this musical harmony, or think of this as, you could use any other visuals that you might think. So do you think that we should actually bring that out and say this is what we're trying to do at our classes, or just let that kind of be in the background of how I like present?
I would say both and, in the background and being specifically articulate about it. And we're going to talk about it this afternoon, the practicalities of this, but let me say that I don't think we can expect them to be able to articulate it unless they receive it as a unified set of truths, as a proposal. So I think what this is going to require, presenting the truths, each individual truth of the faith as an organic whole, is presenting it in such a way that it's connected to the kerygma, connected to the good news of our redemption in Jesus. And that's something, that's a mindset, that's a skill, that's an ability that the catechist has to have in order to see the relation. If I'm in a marriage prep course and I'm teaching marriage prep and the question of contraception comes up, for example, well, I've got to be able to see clearly what the church is teaching regarding contraception. It has to do with the love of God, into which we are all called. I have to be able to see that connection very, very clearly so that I can present it in that way. Okay, so Jungmann described, I think this is really, really helpful. He gave two different images for how the content of the faith can be communicated, can be passed on. And the first is the image of the hub and the spokes of a wheel. And the second is the image of the links in a chain. Let's take a look at this second one first, because this is what he was really critical of at his time, and he thought this would do damage over the long term. The links in a chain. So, link number one in the link of a chain, let's imagine, is the kerygma. It's the good news of our redemption in Jesus. And then link number 2 is God the Father. Link number 3 is God the Son. Link number 4 is the Holy Spirit. Link number 5 is the church. The next 7 links are each of the 7 sacraments. And then we, link number, I lost count, where we link number 46 is the 4 different forms of prayer. Link number 50 is the rosary. And we're sort of connecting the faith and the doctrine in this way. Okay? He was very concerned about that, because which link is most important? Is there any hierarchy to the links in a chain? No. I mean, without the clasp, if the links were all just united with one another, there's no way to see that any of those links is more important than the other. If link number 1 or link number 2 or 3 is the kerygma, and we're all the way to link number 87, which is the sacrament of baptism, let's say. In order to understand what the sacrament of baptism has to do with the kerygma, what do you have to do? Just logically in your mind, intellectually, what do you have to do? You've got to go backwards now, right? You have to go backwards in the links in order to okay, so baptism follows on this, which follows on this, which follows on this. We're going to get all the way back to the kerygma. Who's going to do that? Let me give you an example of this. When I was working in the Archdiocese of Washington a long, long time ago, one of my responsibilities as the coordinator of catechist formation was to form a team who would go out and form catechists around the diocese. And in addition to the formation that we would offer for catechists, we would then go out and sit in on their presentations and evaluate them. Well, this one particular night, I went to a parish, and the formator for that night was an amazing woman. She was a doctoral candidate at Catholic University of America. She knew the faith. She loved the faith. and she was teaching on the sacrament of baptism. And she gave an extraordinary catechesis on baptism, and there were lots of questions and a great interchange that happened. And afterwards, she came over and she said, James, so what did you think? And we talked through it, and I talked about all of the things that I saw in her presentation that were exemplary. And then at the very end, I said, I just have one question. While you were teaching about baptism, I never heard you mention Jesus at all. And without batting an eye, she said, oh, well, I wouldn't have done that. We did Jesus 2 months ago in this class. So 2 months ago, I had, we spent a whole session on the incarnation and the Paschal mystery and, how we come to know Jesus and encounter him today. So what I'm doing is I'm building upon that foundation that we established 2 months ago. Okay, brothers and sisters, what's the problem? Is there a problem? What's the problem? They're not showing the connection?
It's not interwoven into everything.
That's right.
Saying do.
And what happens when he's not interwoven into everything that we teach? It becomes possible for someone, after 12 years of Catholic education, to leave the church and say, well, I never knew Jesus until I joined this community over here. It's tragic when that happens, isn't it? And I have lots of people in my family, my extended family, who they left, and this was one of the reasons why. So she was very well intentioned, and she's an excellent teacher, and I'm sure she did a great job teaching about Jesus. But this is the essential thread that unites everything that we teach, right? He is the way to the Father. He is the one that we propose throughout the whole process of catechesis. Thank you back to Pope Francis. So, for her, as a systematic theologian, it was very, very clear in her mind the connection to baptism. But that connection has to be reinforced. We can't presume it in people. Otherwise, what they receive is a fragmented catechesis, like the links in a chain. Now, Jungmann described that image, and then he juxtaposed it with another image, and that is the hub and the spokes of a wheel. And I think you can see where we're going with this, right? What is the hub in the mind of Father Jungmann? Jesus. And by Jesus, the language he used is language which St. Paul uses. The mystery of Christ is at the very center. And today, there's so many different ways to articulate that. We can say the mystery of Christ. We can say, with John Paul II, intimate communion with Jesus, who leads us in the Holy Spirit to the Father. But at the center is, Sherry Waddell might say that at the center is life in Christ. The proposal of discipleship is at the center. But then everything that we teach, no matter what, has to get explicitly connected to that proposal of life in Jesus. No matter what we're teaching. Prayer. What does prayer have to do with communion with Jesus? What does and this might sound weird, but I think there's a lot of people who don't really understand. What does Mass have to do with our communion with Jesus? Now you might be thinking, well, of course they know that when they receive communion, that's Jesus himself. But as we know, there are fewer and fewer Catholics who are convicted of that truth. And I would argue, I teach liturgy at Franciscan as well these days, it's not just receiving communion, which is our encounter with Jesus in the Mass. There's something even greater taking place there. Receiving communion is the high point, it's the climactic moment of a very profound encounter with Jesus that takes place. Okay, so is that helpful? Thinking about it, in these two paradigms here, the hub and the spokes of a wheel. So there's a clear connection. In the afternoon, I'm going to talk really explicitly and practically about what that means to have this connection in our catechesis. So Jungmann's work spurred great fascination, lots of discussion, lots of books, lots of scholarly writing, lots of enthusiasm, lots of practical catechetical things. I gave a presentation in the diocese a couple of years ago about this, and there was a religious sister who came up afterwards, and she was just glowing. And she said, James, I remember when I was 16 years old, growing up in Wisconsin, I remember my Catholic school teacher talking about the links in a chain and the spokes of a wheel. And that's what, it lit a fire in me to be able to teach the faith in that kind of a way. And I'd forgotten all about that. Isn't that cool? I think that's really cool. So there was a lot of pastoral discussion about how to do this. A really good question that we could ask is, what happened to this approach after the Second Vatican Council? The Second Vatican Council absolutely takes up. I mean, Father Jungmann was invited to be a contributor to the council. He was so highly esteemed at this time. And so you can see his imprint on, he wrote articles about conscious Catholicism. And he was a contributor, an expert contributor to the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, whose most famous line is, the reform of the liturgy, what's the goal of the reform of the liturgy? Full conscious, hello Father Jungmann, active participation. So he contributed significantly to the council. But I think we could ask, what happened after? Because what happened after in the 1970s and in the 1980s was not even close to what Father Jungmann was proposing when it comes to Kerygmatic Catechesis. He was suggesting that Christian doctrine should be taught in a way that is deeply rooted in the proclamation of God's love. But instead, what happened in many, many places during that era was a proclamation of God's love without the content, the doctrinal content of the faith. So what happened is we and I remember I was catechized in the late 1970s. I remember hearing and seeing in the textbooks a lot about Jesus' unconditional love, but not in a way that was connected to the doctrine that catechesis passes on. Right? It's almost as if we went an either-or approach rather than the both-and, which is what Father Jungmann was proposing. Okay, one last historical development that I think is really, really helpful to us. In 1971, something significant happened. The Second Vatican Council had mandated a catechetical directory be written. And it was the first catechetical directory. It was the GCD, which preceded the GDC, which preceded the DC that we have today. And this is very, very fascinating, something that happened between 1971 and 1975, okay? 1971, in Articles 17 to 18, the GCD understood evangelization to be one of the four forms of the ministry of the Word. So in other words, how is the Word of God ministered to the world today? Four primary ways: evangelization, catechesis, liturgy, and theology are the four primary ways this takes place. Now, listen really carefully to how the directory defined evangelization. Evangelization is, I have a slide, yes. Evangelization is missionary preaching, which has as its purpose the arousing of the beginnings of faith so that people will adhere to the Word of God. does that? Who are the evangelists? According to this language in the
People who go on missions.
yeah, I mean, that's I think, an initial identification that we have with this is, all right, missionary preaching is those who go out to the developing world, people who don't know Jesus, and there's a missionary preaching there. And the aim and the objective of that missionary preaching is to arouse the beginnings of faith. And then what is catechesis in the language of the directory? Catechesis intends to make people's faith become living, conscious, there's that word again, and active through the light of instruction. Now, let's pause just for a second. Out of these ideas here grew a very common paradigm. And the paradigm was that evangelization, which is missionary preaching, which has as its aim the arousing of faith, missionary preaching ought to precede catechesis. Okay. Now, what do you like about that idea? And there's a lot to like about that. And this is a really helpful insight of the church, that those who are being catechized need to be evangelized first, right? Something ought to happen before we dive into the systematic teaching of the faith. So what do you like about that idea?
I think in proclaiming the gospel, like that news that God came down to earth and became meant for you,
Yeah.
it's inviting towards people. They feel that I am loved, I matter, and then it kind of creates that desire for that relationship to build, and then you're interested, and then you want to delve in that knowledge of the doctrine and the teaching.
Absolutely. Which one of us wouldn't love to have 40% of your students that you're teaching be in that exact situation, where they've been evangelized, meaning there's a desire for God within them that they are now attuned to, and they want to know what it is you're going to teach. Would you love it if 40%, 50%, 60% of your students are like that? So it's a helpful insight here that something ought to precede catechesis. But can you see any possible negative ramifications of saying that evangelization should precede catechesis? And what is catechesis? It's instruction in the content of the faith. Any negative consequences with this?
It's easy to assume that that's one step and then move on to the next step and forget about the evangelization and just focus on, okay, now we're going to teach you.
Therefore, what does that mean for what catechesis is?
Well, it would be that it's all about head knowledge, and not about the heart.
Now, is that an idea that's sort of familiar to you in your parish? That what is catechesis? It's instruction in the content of the faith. And so as a catechist, with this paradigm, I would be able to say, oh, you want to be evangelized? Well, here are the places where evangelization happens in our parish. It happens at the Mass, it happens in the sacraments, it happens in the Bible study, it happens in the prayer group, it happens if you go to youth ministry, it happens if you go to a youth conference, it happens, hey, go to World Youth Day. A lot of evangelization happens there. But here in catechesis, this is where we focus on learning and understanding the content of the faith. And so there can be a bit of a bifurcation here between these two. You see that?